An alleged royal power struggle is making headlines after reports claim Prince William took decisive action at Windsor with Princess Anne.
Prince William has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally shattering decades of dynastic silence, delivering a devastating and calculated blow that has rippled through every corridor of Windsor Castle, every gilded chamber of Buckingham Palace, and every whispered conversation inside the ruthless machinery of the British monarchy. In a move that has left even the most seasoned royal correspondents choked speechless, the future king has quietly, coldly, and with the surgical precision of a man who has waited nearly 2 decades for this exact moment, expelled Camilla's grandson from the sacred grounds of Windsor, drawing a line so sharp, so unflinching, so utterly final, that the palace machinery itself has been thrown into a state of suffocating panic. This was not a public spectacle. This was not a tabloid leak. This was the quiet, devastating hand of a son who has finally decided that the promise he once made to a mother, lying in a Paris hospital bed, her chestnut hair matted with blood, her blue eyes fluttering closed forever, would no longer be broken. And now, as Princess Anne's chilling silence speaks louder than any royal decree ever could, the entire world is left reeling with 3 haunting questions that refuse to be silenced. What exactly did Queen Elizabeth predict about this precise confrontation in a sealed letter left inside the Windsor archives? Why did William explicitly forbid the Parker Bowles bloodline from ever crossing the threshold of the residence his mother once called her sanctuary? And what dark, hidden tragedy finally compelled the Prince of Wales to weaponize the very institution that once devoured Diana Spencer alive? The morning light broke pale and biting over the ancient stones of Windsor Castle on that crisp Tuesday. A thin frost still clinging to the manicured hedges of the East Terrace, the pale English sun struggling weakly through a low ceiling of gunmetal cloud. Inside the private study on the 2nd floor of Adelaide Cottage, Prince William stood motionless before a tall mullioned window, his broad shoulders drawn tight beneath a charcoal suit jacket, his jaw set in that unmistakable Spencer line his mother had bequeathed him. On the mahogany desk behind him, atop a Persian rug worn thin by 3 centuries of sovereign footsteps, sat a single cream-colored envelope, its edges yellowed with time, its wax seal a deep, arterial crimson, stamped with a crest that had not been used in official palace correspondence since August of 1997. The scent of aged paper, of pipe tobacco long absorbed into wood, of dust motes dancing lazily in the shafts of gray light, filled the cavernous, hauntingly quiet room. And there, resting beside the envelope, catching the pale morning light with a soft, tarnished gleam, was a small silver pin shaped like a swallow in flight, its tiny wings outstretched, its eye a single chip of sapphire. William did not touch it, he simply stared. For 28 years, that pin had waited. For 28 years, so had he. His press secretary, a tall, gaunt man named Ian Whitmore who had served the Wales household for over a decade, entered the study with the soft, deferential tread of a man who understood that this morning was unlike any other in his career. His hands, William noticed with a flicker of grim recognition, were trembling faintly, and a bead of sweat had gathered at his hairline despite the morning chill. Whitmore cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the encrypted feed from Clarence House has been attempting to reach this line for the last 40 minutes. Her Majesty's private secretary has called 3 times. Buckingham Palace communications are requesting, and I quote, immediate clarification on the security directive issued last night." William did not turn from the window. His voice, when it came, was growly, weighted, deliberate, each word carved from something harder than stone. "Tell them, Ian, that for 28 years the world has spoken for my mother. Today I am speaking for her." The directive itself had been issued at 11:47 the previous night, a single, quietly worded internal palace memo bearing the seal of the Prince of Wales's household. It was 3 paragraphs long. It was devastating in its restraint. It stipulated, with the cold precision of a surgical instrument, that no member of the Parker Bowles lineage, specifically the grandchildren of Her Majesty Queen Camilla, would henceforth be granted access to the private residential quarters, family gatherings, or official ceremonial functions held on the Windsor estate. There was no mention of Camilla herself, there was no mention of Charles, there was no accusation, no explanation, no press briefing. There was only the signature, in that unmistakable slanted hand, of William, Prince of Wales. And beneath it, in a smaller, almost forgotten line, the notation, "Per failsafe protocol, sealed August 1997. Whitmore had read those words 3 times before understanding what they meant. And when he had understood, he had reached for the whiskey decanter in his office with hands that would not stop shaking for the next 6 hours. The story, as William now knew with the terrible mathematical precision of a prophecy fulfilled, had begun long before that Paris tunnel, long before the flashbulbs and the wreckage and the black Mercedes crumpled against pillar number 13. It had begun in the autumn of 1995, in a rain-soaked drawing room at Highgrove, when a small boy of 13 had sat cross-legged on the rug beside his mother as she wept into her hands. Diana had worn her cream silk blouse that day, William remembered, and a strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, and her chestnut hair had fallen forward to hide her face. The rain had drummed against the tall windows in a slow, insistent rhythm. A grandfather clock somewhere in the hall had chimed the quarter hour, and Diana had reached out and taken her elder son's hand and pressed something small and cold into his palm. It had been a silver swallow pin. "Willie, my darling," she had whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "If anything ever happens to me, promise Mummy something. Promise me you will never let them near your brother. Not the woman. Not her children. Not her children's children. They are not our family. They will never be our family. Promise, Mummy." And William, at 13, understanding only a fraction of what those words truly meant, had promised. He had folded his small hand around the swallow pin. He had promised. Across the manicured lawns of Windsor, in the quieter, more austere apartments reserved for the working royals, Princess Anne received the news of her nephew's directive at 7:18 that morning, brought to her by her own private secretary as she finished her second cup of black tea. She read the memo once, she read it a second time. She set the paper down on the breakfast table beside her half-eaten toast, and then, in a gesture that would later be described by every senior courtier as the most eloquent silence in modern royal history, she simply folded the paper in half, slid it into the pocket of her tweed riding jacket, and said absolutely nothing. Her secretary waited. He waited a full minute. He waited for the objection, the disapproval, the demand for immediate intervention. It never came. Anne merely lifted her teacup, took a long, considered sip, and gazed out the window at the pale winter sky. "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" the secretary asked at last, his voice barely audible. "No, Charles," she said quietly. "Nothing at all." And in that single word, that single gentle nothing, the entire architecture of the modern British monarchy shifted upon its ancient foundations. Because Anne knew. Anne had always known. Anne had been there in the summer of 1992 when Diana had come to Gatcombe Park in a state of quiet, controlled desperation, her makeup smudged from crying on the drive down, her hands twisting a linen handkerchief until the fabric had begun to fray. The two women had walked together for over an hour along the winding paths of Anne's private garden, past the rose bushes heavy with white blooms, past the ornamental pond where a single gray heron stood motionless in the shallows. And Diana had told Anne, in a voice that alternated between fury and grief, about the courtier, about the tall, silver-haired man in the charcoal suit and the polished Oxford shoes, the man with the cold, pale eyes and the clipboard always tucked beneath his arm, the man who had spent the better part of a decade, quietly, methodically, and with the venomous patience of a hunting spider, engineering the systematic isolation of the Princess of Wales from her own children, her own household, her own sanity. Diana had named him that day. She had named him to Anne. And Anne, in the terrible, aristocratic composure that had defined her entire life, had listened and remembered and said nothing. Until now. Now at last her silence spoke. The man in question, the invisible architect, the true engineer of the machinery that had ground Diana Spencer to dust, was not and had never been a royal by blood. He was a senior palace operative, a private secretary whose title had shifted subtly over the decades but whose influence had only grown, a man who had entered royal service in 1979 as a junior aide and who, through a combination of cold ambition, ruthless discretion, and a genuine talent for the darker arts of institutional survival, had risen to become one of the most powerful unelected figures in the modern British state. He had been the one, in the winter of 1993, who had authored the confidential memo suggesting that the Princess of Wales's mental fragility posed an ongoing risk to the stability of the succession. He had been the one, in the spring of 1996, who had orchestrated the strategic media leaks that had systematically dismantled her public reputation piece by careful piece. He had been the one, in the terrible summer of 1997, who had made the private phone calls to Paris. The calls that were never logged, the calls that were never explained. And he was still there. He was still, in the year of our Lord 2026, walking those same polished corridors, sitting those same paneled offices, whispering into the same royal ears. And William knew. William had always known. The letter had told him everything. The letter had been placed into William's hands on the morning of his 18th birthday, borne down from a locked cabinet in the private study of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, delivered by the Queen herself in a small ceremony witnessed by no one but her cocker spaniel and the ticking of a Georgian carriage clock. His grandmother had held the envelope in her small, veined hands, and she had looked at him with those famously piercing blue eyes, and she had said, in that clipped, precise voice that had ruled a commonwealth for half a century, "William, my dear boy, your mother left this with me the summer before she died. She was very clear. You were to receive it on this day, and not one day sooner. What you do with it, when you do it, and how you do it, is entirely a matter for you. But know this, my darling grandson. Your mother was not mad. She was never mad. She was merely, and I say this with the deepest regret of my life, correct. And then the Queen had pressed the envelope into his hands, kissed his forehead once, and left him alone in the room. William had not opened the letter that day. He had not opened it for many years. He had waited. He had watched. He had learned the shape of the machinery that had killed his mother. And he had learned the faces of the men who operated it. And he had waited for the moment when the machinery would attempt to reach for his own children. And then, 3 weeks ago, it had reached. The incident itself had been small, almost trivial, the kind of thing that a lesser man, a less watchful son, might have overlooked entirely. There had been a proposal, quietly floated through Clarence House, and forwarded via 3 layers of intermediaries to Adelaide Cottage, that Camilla's grandson should be included in a small family gathering at Windsor over the coming Easter holidays. The suggestion had been framed as a gesture of unity, a healing of old wounds, an opportunity for the younger generation to bond in the informal setting of a family Easter egg hunt on the Long Walk. It had been presented as harmless, it had been presented as sweet, and it had been, William recognized immediately with a coldness that surprised even himself, the opening move in a very old and very familiar game, because attached to the proposal, in the fine print of the accompanying briefing memorandum, had been a recommendation from a certain senior courtier that the gathering be documented for internal palace records, that select photographs be made available to sympathetic press outlets, and that the young Parker Bowles child be seated, per protocol suggestions, at the immediate right hand of Prince George. William had read the memorandum 3 times. He had noted the signature at the bottom, and he had felt for the first time in 28 years the swallow pin burn cold against his chest where it rested, always in the interior pocket of his suit jacket. 20 million people were watching live by the time the first coded murmurs of the directive began to leak through the encrypted back channels of the Royal Press Corps, across pubs in Edinburgh and living rooms in Cardiff, across the tea-time kitchens of Manchester and the office break rooms of Canary Wharf. Television screens flickered as breaking news banners began to crawl across the bottom of the BBC feed. Something had happened at Windsor. Something enormous. Something that no one in official palace communications was willing to confirm or deny. The nation held its breath. In the press room at Buckingham Palace, 3 separate senior correspondents were seen physically running down the corridor toward the press office, their mobile phones pressed to their ears. In the private study at Adelaide Cottage, an antique rotary telephone, one of the few remaining direct lines between the residences of the Prince of Wales and His Majesty the King, began to ring with a slow, insistent, mechanical urgency. William stared at it for a long moment. He let it ring 4 times. Then he lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was not his father's. William had expected it to be, had steeled himself for the confrontation with the king, for the paternal fury and the constitutional lecturing and the invocations of duty and unity and family. But the voice that came through the crackling encrypted line was not the king. It was Harry. Harry, calling from a location William did not immediately recognize, from a satellite phone whose signal wavered and pulsed with the unmistakable static of transatlantic transmission. And Harry's voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of the Duke of Sussex, not the voice of the estranged prince who had spent 5 years across an ocean building a life apart. It was the voice of a 15-year-old boy standing beside a coffin draped in the royal standard, walking behind his mother's body through the streets of London, staring at his own polished black shoes because he could not bear to lift his eyes and see the world watching him grieve. "Willie," Harry choked out, and the single syllable was the broken sob of a boy who had never fully stopped being 15. "Willie, is it true? Have you done it? Have you actually done it?" And William, closing his eyes against the sudden burning behind them, gripped the receiver until his knuckles turned white. "Yes, Harold," he whispered. "I've done it. I promised Mummy. I've finally done it." There was a long silence on the line. William could hear his brother breathing, the ragged, uneven breath of a man, and failing to hold himself together. In the background, faintly, he could hear the sound of a child laughing, one of Harry's own children, oblivious in some sun-drenched Californian garden to the seismic tremor rippling through the ancient foundations of the House of Windsor. When Harry spoke again, his voice was steadier, but stripped of any sovereign authority, stripped of any performance, stripped down to the bone. "The swallow, Willie. Do you still have it?" And William, his own throat tightening, reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and drew out the small silver pin, the tarnished wings, the single chip of sapphire eye. "I have it, Harold. I've had it every day for 28 years. Harry made a sound then, a small broken laugh that dissolved into something wetter. "Then it's done. Then she can rest, Willie. Then Mummy can finally rest." The line went dead. William stood very still, the receiver still pressed against his ear, listening to the soft crackling static of an empty transatlantic line, the swallow pin cold and heavy in his palm. He turned at last and crossed the study to the mahogany desk. The cream-colored envelope waited exactly where it had waited for the last 18 years. since the day his grandmother had pressed it into his hands. The crimson wax seal was unbroken. William drew a small silver letter opener from the desk drawer, its handle engraved with the tiny cipher of the Prince of Wales, and slid the blade beneath the wax. The seal cracked with a sound like a small, bone-breaking, unnaturally loud in the cavernous silence of the room. He unfolded the letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the kind of expensive stationery Diana had favored during the last years of her life. The handwriting was hers unmistakably, that looping, generous, slightly forward-slanting hand that had signed 1,000 school permission slips and 1,000 birthday cards and 1,000 thank-you notes to the strangers who had loved her from a distance. William began to read. "My darling William," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer with you and your beloved brother. I want you to know, first and always, that I loved you both more than I ever loved anything in this world or the next, and that every breath I drew from the moment you were placed in my arms was drawn for you. But I am writing to you now, not as your mother, but as your protector, and I must tell you the truth about what is happening, and about what will continue to happen long after I am gone. There is a man inside the palace, William. He has been there for many years, and he will be there for many years to come. He wears a charcoal suit and Oxford shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he carries a leather clipboard, and his eyes are the pale gray of a winter sea. His name I will write on the second page of this letter, so that you may know him by more than description. But I beg you, my darling, do not speak his name aloud until the day comes when you can destroy him. And that day will come, I have seen it. He is not alone. He is the head of a small group, no more than 5 men, who have decided, without the knowledge or consent of the crown itself, that the future of the monarchy must be shaped in their image. They have decided that certain people are useful to their vision, and that certain people are obstacles. I am, my darling, an obstacle, and so in time will you be." William's hands were shaking now. The pale morning light through the mullioned window had shifted, casting long golden bars across the desk, illuminating the swallow pin, the broken wax seal, the trembling paper. He forced himself to continue reading. "They will use the woman, my darling. They will use her, and they will use her children, and they will use her children's children. Not because they love her, but because she is a useful vessel for their long design. They will place her family close to yours, closer and closer, year by year, until the distinction between blood and imitation begins to blur in the eye of the public and in the eye of history. And when your own sons are grown, William, they will attempt to place her descendants beside them, to elevate them, to knit them into the royal fabric so tightly that no future king may ever untangle them. You must not let this happen. You must draw the line, and you must draw it early, and you must draw it without apology or explanation. Your grandmother knows this. Your Aunt Anne knows this. They will both, in their silence, support you when the day comes. Trust their silence, my darling. It is worth more than 1,000 speeches." The date on the letter, written in Diana's own hand at the top of the first page, was the 14th of August, 1997, 17 days before her death. Yesterday, in the 28 years since, had been the anniversary of the day she had written it. William lowered the letter. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the study was the ticking of a small ormolu clock on the mantelpiece and the distant, muffled cawing of a raven somewhere out on the east terrace. He turned the page. There, in Diana's looping hand, was a single name. William read it. He closed his eyes. He had known, of course. He had known for years. But there was a difference between knowing and seeing the name written in his mother's hand, in her own ink, on paper she had touched with her own fingers 11 days before a black Mercedes had entered a Paris tunnel at 95 miles per hour and never emerged. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside its cream-colored envelope. Then he reached beneath the desk to a small mahogany panel that had gone unremarked by 3 generations of royal staff and pressed his thumb against a hidden brass catch. There was a soft mechanical click. A false-bottomed compartment slid open, revealing a small steel box, its surface engraved with the tiny cipher of the Prince of Wales. Inside the box, wrapped in acid-free tissue, was a second document. This one was not from his mother. This one was a forensic report, commissioned privately, executed by 2 former MI6 analysts and 1 former Metropolitan Police cryptographer, delivered to William 6 months ago in absolute secrecy. It confirmed, with biometric matches and cryptographic signatures and metadata analysis of communications intercepts spanning nearly 3 decades, every single thing his mother had written in her letter. The name at the top of the report was the same name written in Diana's hand on the second page of her letter. The trap had been set, and now at last it had been sprung. Ian Whitmore reappeared at the study door, his face the color of old parchment. "Sir," he said, and his voice cracked audibly on the single word. "Sir, Buckingham Palace has just issued a statement. Or rather, they have declined to issue a statement. The press office is refusing all questions. His Majesty is said to be indisposed. Her Majesty Queen Camilla has reportedly left Clarence House by private car for an undisclosed location. And sir, most extraordinary of all, Princess Anne has just released a 2-word statement through her own private office." William looked up slowly. "And what, Ian, are those two words?" Whitmore swallowed. "No comment, sir. Simply no comment." William nodded once, a small, grim, satisfied nod. In the language of the House of Windsor, in the ancient coded tongue of the aristocracy, no comment from Princess Anne was not the absence of a statement. It was the loudest possible statement imaginable. It was permission. It was benediction. It was the entire weight of the Princess Royal, the most senior working royal of her generation, the daughter of Elizabeth II herself, coming down decisively and irrevocably on the side of her nephew. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses froze mid-air. In the newsrooms of Fleet Street, seasoned editors who had covered every royal scandal since the abdication of Edward VIII stared at their screens in stunned, uncomprehending silence. On social media, hashtags began to trend within minutes, but the tone was not the usual frothing outrage of a royal controversy. The tone was something quieter, something more reverent, something that felt almost like the collective indrawn breath of a nation that had just watched a very old and very deep wound being cauterized at last. In her modest apartments at St. James's Palace, an elderly former lady-in-waiting who had served the Princess of Wales in the final years of her life, a woman now in her late 80s who rarely left her rooms, was seen by her nurse to be weeping quietly at her window. When the nurse gently asked what was wrong, the old woman had smiled through her tears and said only, "Nothing is wrong, my dear." For the first time in 28 years, absolutely nothing is wrong. The satellite phone on William's desk vibrated a second time. He looked at the screen. The caller identification showed only a string of encrypted numbers, but he recognized the pattern. It was Clarence House. It was at last his father. William drew a slow, steadying breath. He thought of the boy of 13 who had promised his weeping mother in a rain-soaked drawing room at Highgrove. He thought of the boy of 15 who had walked behind her coffin through the silent streets of London with his brother beside him and his eyes fixed on his own polished shoes. He thought of the man of 43 he had become, standing now in a study filled with pale morning light, holding a swallow pin in his palm and a broken wax seal on his desk, and a mother's 28-year-old letter in his heart. He lifted the phone. "It's Papa," he said quietly. "I am listening." The voice on the other end, when it came, was thin, exhausted, and unmistakably ill. The king was not shouting. The king was not commanding. The king was, William realized with a small pang that surprised him, weeping. "William," Charles said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "William, my dear boy. I did not know all of it. I swear to you, on your mother's memory, I did not know all of it." And William, closing his eyes, said the words he had rehearsed silently for 18 years, ever since the morning his grandmother had pressed a cream-colored envelope into his hands. "I know you did not know all of it, Papa, but you knew enough, and now at last, so does everyone else." The line went silent. William did not hang up. He simply lowered the phone and set it gently on the desk, beside the swallow pin and the broken seal and his mother's letter. Outside the mullioned window, the pale winter sun had climbed high enough to touch the tops of the ancient oaks that lined the long walk, catching the frost on their bare branches and turning it briefly for a suspended moment into something that looked almost like fire. In a Californian garden 6,000 miles away, a man who had once been a 15-year-old boy walking behind his mother's coffin sat down on a wooden bench, put his face in his hands, and wept quietly while his own small son played in the grass beside him. In a modest apartment at St. James's Palace, an elderly former lady-in-waiting closed her eyes and, for the first time in 28 years, slept peacefully in her chair. And in the tack room at Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne, having finished her morning ride, hung her tweed jacket on its accustomed hook, felt the folded paper still tucked inside the pocket, and permitted herself the smallest and most private of smiles. The senior courtier at the heart of the machinery, the man whose name was written in Diana's own hand on the second page of a letter dated the 14th of August, 1997, received the news of the Windsor directive at 8:43 that morning in his office at Buckingham Palace. He was 71 years old now, his hair fully silver, his charcoal suit as immaculately pressed as it had been on the day he had first entered royal service in 1979. He read the directive. He read it a second time. He set the paper down on his mahogany desk, on a Persian rug that had been walked upon by 3 generations of royal aides, and he reached for the telephone on his desk to make one of the many calls he had made over the decades to shape the machinery to his will. He lifted the receiver. There was no dial tone. He pressed the receiver hook. Still nothing. He picked up his mobile phone. It had been remotely disabled. He walked to the door of his office. It was locked from the outside. He was not going to be arrested. He was not going to be prosecuted. He was simply, and with the surgical precision of a failsafe protocol, drafted 28 years earlier by a princess who had known exactly what she was doing, being erased. His pension would be honored. His name would never be spoken. His office would be quietly cleared over the weekend. He would leave royal service on Monday morning with a modest ceremony and a modest gift and a modest severance, and he would spend the remaining years of his life in a modest cottage in Hampshire, and he would never again set foot inside a royal residence for as long as he lived. He was cornered. He was finished. He was at last done. William gathered the letter, the forensic report, and the small silver swallow pin. He wrapped them together in a length of black velvet and placed them inside a small oak casket that had once belonged to his mother. He carried the casket himself, unaccompanied by staff, out of Adelaide Cottage and across the frost-crusted grass of the home park, past the long walk, past the frozen ornamental lake, all the way to the small private chapel where his grandmother lay at rest beside her husband. He knelt at the altar. He placed the casket in a small stone recess behind the altar, a recess that had been prepared years earlier at his private instruction, a recess that no one in the palace machinery knew existed. He closed the stone. He knelt for a long moment in the pale winter silence of that ancient chapel, and he whispered, so quietly that no ear but the walls could hear him, "It's done, Mummy. I kept my promise. You can rest now. You can finally rest." And a single tear traced slowly down his cheek, catching the winter light before falling silently onto the cold stone floor. By late afternoon, the story had been quietly, almost invisibly, buried by every major British news outlet, guided by a coordinated but discreet flurry of palace communications, suggesting that the entire matter had been an internal administrative reorganization of no public significance. There would be no scandal. There would be no royal biography detailing the confrontation. There would be no dramatic parliamentary inquiry. The machinery, as it always did, had absorbed the wound and closed over it, leaving only the faintest scar visible to those who knew where to look. But those who knew, knew. And in the private drawing rooms of the British aristocracy, in the paneled offices of the senior civil service, in the quiet whispers exchanged between the last surviving friends of the Princess of Wales, the truth of what had happened at Windsor that Tuesday morning would be spoken of in reverent, hushed tones for the rest of the 21st century. William had done it. William had actually done it. William had kept his promise. That evening, as the pale winter light drained from the sky over Windsor and the ancient stones of the castle sank into their long violet shadows, the BBC ended its evening broadcast without commentary, without music, with only a single still image held on screen for a full 10 seconds before the transmission cut to black. The image was of Windsor Castle at dusk, the Union flag flying at full mast above the round tower, and a single small bird, wings outstretched, caught in flight against the fading sky, a swallow. The broadcast cut to black. The nation exhaled. Somewhere in a Californian garden, a brother wept softly beside his laughing child. Somewhere in a modest apartment at St. James's Palace, an old woman slept peacefully in her chair for the first time in 28 years. Somewhere in an ancient chapel in the home park at Windsor, a mother finally at long last rested. The swallow had flown free. The truth had saved her boys. The promise had been kept. And across a stunned and silent United Kingdom, the last light of a long winter day faded into darkness, and nothing, absolutely nothing at all, moved.